been chewing my lip over whether or not to talk about this for some time now because I've really wanted to talk about it, but I wanted to do it in a way that wasn't insulting or redundant. And I say redundant specifically because right as I was thinking about doing this video, someone else, the wonderful Elliot Brooks, came along on her channel and completely preempted me. And then I said, maybe it's better to be a little bit redundant to find out what individual points of view that I can give on this subject, because I do have a lot to say. Because as you can guess from the title, this is about the use of generative AI in writing. And I want very badly to say something as blunt and total and easy as it stinks, don't ever use it for anything. See, I don't know if you know this, but my day job is covering the IT industry as a writer. And I get exposed to a lot of material about AI. And to the degree that I can make constructive suggestions about how to work with AI for my target audience there, which is software developers for business, I will do that. And AI covers a lot more than just the generative AI field, for one. But I am deeply uneasy about the use of generative AI in creative fields. Now, the reason I've been biting my lip about this, again, is because I wanted to talk about it without making it sound like I think everyone who uses generative AI for anything is just unilaterally bad. I don't think shaming people is going to accomplish a great deal. Now, if they're doing something super duper egregious, like passing off an entire generated work as their own creation, that's a different story. So I'm not talking about folks who want to use generative AI for things like polishing an existing work incrementally or experimenting with generated mock-ups of cover art before they pass that along to an actual artist, stuff like that. Those people aren't the bad guys. What I am thinking of, and again, even these people I want to treat as fairly as I can, I am thinking of people who use these tools and systems as a wholesale substitute for engaging with the process of creating anything. I am thinking of people who see generative AI as a creative cheat code. Because the very specific way that generative AI works, to my mind, exposes the cheat code mindset very nakedly. And it does so much more so than, for instance, people who are doing things like using stock art to make collages or sampling other people's music. See, one of the things about writing, and any creative work really, is that it's easy to believe that it's all about the finished product. It's easy to believe it's about saying, I wrote a book, because that's how we tell the doers from the sayers, right? Everyone can say they want to write a book. Not many people can put an actual finished book with their name on it in your hands. So it's not surprising that there's this focus on the finished product or the artifact, because that's the evidence you did the work. And all of this is true, up to a point, because the finished work is not the only part of the picture. It's just the final, most visible stage. The reason people make things is not just to end up with a finished product. It's to go through all the stages of making the thing. The research, the trial, the rough drafts, the polishing, the editing, the cleanup, the postmortem, all of it, including and especially the stuff most other people will never get to see. What I object to is the use of these tools as a way to cheat yourself out of the stages of the process. What I object to is when people confuse one part of the process, the delivering of the product, with the whole process. Now, one possible counter to this would go something like, well, I'm not using these tools for the whole thing. I just want some help with this thing or that bit. And again, I don't think that attitude is worth getting too uptight about. There are bigger fish to fry. But I do want to say that if generative tools tend to be your first line of recourse for some kind of help with a creative work, it's worth asking yourself why. Is it because of the cost, because it's cheap? Is it because the convenience trumps everything else? And these are tough things to argue with. Money is tight. Time is tight. And, if you feel like you're in a hurry, or if you're strapped and you can't pay somebody to do a good line edit, then it's easy to believe a generative tool is the best solution. But you do need to think about whether or not you've cheated yourself out of the chance to find other people who can help you at least as well, if not better. Perhaps not at the same pace, and maybe also at a fairly affordable price. For instance, many writers' communities flourish around the web, like Absolute Write, for instance. I'll link to them down in the description, where for the price of engaging with the community for a little bit, you get feedback from real human beings, and it's likely to be far more diverse and targeted and thoughtful and constructive than machine feedback. So think for a bit about what the cost of your opting for convenience amounts to. If you feel that the cost is trivial enough that it doesn't invalidate what you're doing as a whole, like brainstorming names with ChatGPT or one thing, that's separate. but there is never no cost at all. And that's most worth keeping at the front of your mind. So again, I feel like one of the big downsides of these tools, even if you want to use them in good faith, is how they make it easy to talk yourself out of engaging with other people who can be helpful. And by extension, you end up not learning as deeply as you might about what making these things amounts to, detail for detail. Now, I've mentioned folks who want to use these tools as an end-to-end replacement for creativity. And I feel like they're falling victim to the same fallacy that a musician might if they think that buying a better synthesizer is going to automatically make them a better musician. It might afford them more possibilities they didn't have before. But if they don't know how to make good on those possibilities to begin with, they don't have anything new. And it's hard for me to look at what they're doing in the same light as somebody who makes something end-to-end on their own, who's engaging entirely with the process on a personal level, who doesn't try to outsource any of it. Because I also want to draw a distinction between generative tools and labor-saving tools. The typewriter, and later the computer and the word processor, work to make the process of writing something less laborious. And I know there are people out there who like to write longhand. I'm not making an argument. They're only making things tough on themselves. There's some evidence to the effect that writing longhand actually does make changes in the brain that are positive. But most of us want the act of writing to be reasonably frictionless, so we use a computer. But generative tools are not about reducing the friction involved in making the work. They're about reducing engagement in making the work. And again, that's not an all or nothing thing. If someone uses AI to brainstorm names for towns or monsters or what have you, it's not an issue, at least not as I see it. But again, it's going to come at some cost. And I suspect a big part of what we're going to be sussing out as time goes on is what degree of engagement with these things is going to be suitable, both individually as creators and as a society. See, I don't think generative AI is going away. I think there are going to be many more lawsuits over it. I think there's going to be much more legal struggle and social struggle. And I do think ultimately the people making these tools are going to have to broker some kind of standing compromise with content creators, both existing ones and future ones. But I also feel those compromises are going to favor big corporations with lots of money and lots of lawyers, and they're not going to encompass or protect the little people. But the technology is not going to vanish. It makes sense to have conversations about how much of it is appropriate and in what form. I guess you could call it a harm reduction discussion, to use a phrase that was associated with the treatment of drug addiction. Some of us are not going to want to support these things in any form, and then we're taking an ethical stand. Some of us will still use them, although maybe much more conscientiously about where they came from and how they're built, and in a very narrowly defined way. And for those of us who use them end to end, I suspect the rest of us are going to want to know upfront if we're getting something AI generated from them. I know I do. But I think we need to talk as much as we can about the act of engaging with the creation of the work end to end, as much as we can, because that stuff tends to be invisible. And talking about it helps demystify the process. It makes people who are coming into this for the first time feel less like they have to turn to canned solutions to get anything done. It makes them more willing to actually engage in the process, what they see what the process is. So creators who share their process or talk openly about their struggles with it, they're doing everyone a tremendous service by making clear this stuff is not magic, it's hard work. I think many people who come into creative realms from the outside don't appreciate that what goes on in a creative field, whether it's writing or drawing or making video games or making movies or whatever, most of it is kind of a grind. And the tools we have are not about removing the grind altogether. They're about making them less grindy. So if you remove the grind altogether, I'm not sure you have a creative process anymore. You're not making things so much as you're just going shopping. And while going shopping can be an important part of making things, getting the raw ingredients, raw equipment, it's not meant to substitute wholly for other parts of the process where you have to bring something of your own to the table. Now, I've been through a lot of discussions, or maybe you could say arguments, with people who defend their use of generative AI by describing them as the next generation of creative tools. There's folks who use generative AI to make music or images and then insist that the process of coming up with the prompts and sifting through the results and selecting the best output is as legitimate a creative process as anything else. They will say, how is that any different from a DJ who's working with breaks and samples and whatnot? And I got to admit, that's a tough one. I don't want to be 100% dismissive there. Hip hop and rap went from being disreputable noise made by scratching records to being accepted as relatively mainstream art forms. But it also took a long time to get there. It took decades to get there, and there were serious legal battles all along the way, even deep in the circles where this sort of thing was taken most seriously. There were big legal battles about the reuse of copyrighted material. You can't legitimately reuse someone else's music in another context without crediting and paying royalties. And given how many unanswered questions there are about how these generative models are sourced, what they're made from, what kind of black box systems they are, I get uneasy about the ethics of it. See, if I know that I'm sampling one artist or two, that's one thing, because I know where it came from. I can point to it. But if I'm part of a process that is theoretically ripping off thousands of them at once, that's different. So it's another one where I don't just want to say, no, you're not actually creating anything, but there are still a lot of really tough questions that are not going to be answered through that response. So when people call these things the next generation of creative tools, to the extent that they're right, I think that it is true only in a very constrained way. I think there's this feeling that creativity should be democratized as aggressively as possible. Technology lets us democratize creativity. And that's great. Everyone can have a taste of what it's like to make something, especially those of us short on time and money. There's been a tremendous explosion of personal creativity ever since personal computers reached a certain degree of sophistication and power. And I think all of this is a really important thing to fight for. It's, the idea that we all deserve a shot at being able to make things, at being able to call them our own. But I don't think generative AI gives the kind of freedom to people in the way that they really need to have it. And I'm not sure there's any way to give that kind of freedom to people in a way that doesn't involve some kind of trade-off. And the trade-offs that generative AI provide are not the kind I want to make. Being a writer is about writing, about the act of writing. It's not just about having written something. It goes the same for anything that's creative. It's not just about being able to give somebody a finished artifact. It's about knowing what every step before it amounted to. It's about being able to engage with the whole process. My issue with these tools is how they come at the cost of being disengaged from some part of the process. It's not always a huge one. It's not always a fatal one, but it's never zero. And what's more, it doesn't do people any favors to make them think the creative process is this routine that amounts to getting something out of a vending machine. It's the same mindset that drove the creation of generative AI systems in the first place, the idea that creativity is about nothing but inputs and outputs. And anyone who makes anything knows from experience it isn't just about that. Maybe the whole point of creative work is that there aren't supposed to be any cheat codes. Maybe the whole point is that it's work. So thanks for hearing me out on this. Let me know what you think. Check out Elliot Brooks' own video on this topic too. See what you think about it.